Masechet Avoda Zara, Daf Mem Zayin, Ba'e Rami Bar Hama, Hamishtachavet Chamat Chitim, Mahu Limnachot. Yesh shinui b'nei avad or en shinui b'nei avad. On the previous dapim, we learned a principle that if someone would, let's say, worship a live animal as an avodah zarah, that live animal would remain permitted for a regular person to use, because it's a live animal, it's not going to get a prohibition of idolatry. However, that animal is prohibited to use for a korban. So there's a distinction. In order for something to be used for the mikdash, that is more stringent. And so that is an example of a live animal. And now we're going to test out this distinction in other areas. So Rami Bar Chama asks, if someone would bow down to a wheat stalk that's connected to the ground and treat it as an idol, well, that wheat stalk would remain permitted for secular use. It's connected to the ground, so that's no problem. The question is, what if it's ground up into flour, and then can it be used for a korban mincha, and that would go on the mizbeach? So the question depends on, do we say there's a change in the status of something regarding if it's something that's worshipped, or does it not change status when it changes form? The idea is that this wheat stalk, when it's whole, will be prohibited from being used for gavoa, but once it's changed from a wheat stalk into flour, now it's a different thing. It changes form, it changes name, and therefore do we consider that a new thing? And the prohibition that was on the wheat stalk, because it was worshipped, will be removed because now it's turned into flour. Or no, maybe we say it's the same material, it's the same thing. That's the Rami Bar Chama's question. Amar Mozutra bered Rav Nachman, Tashema, Kol ha'asurin legabe mizbeach veladotehen mutarin, v'tanya la Rabbi Eliezer oser. Mozutra, the son of Rav Nachman, says, I will tell you an answer from a Mishnah in a parallel case. We're going to compare the wheat stalk that's ground into flour and changes form to an animal that becomes prohibited and then has an offspring. What's the status of the offspring? So if an animal becomes prohibited either because it's idolatry or if the animal was involved in a sin of bestiality, that animal becomes prohibited to use as a korban. But what about if it gives birth? So the Tanakh Kama says, "Viladotehen," if offspring is permitted, the offspring was not prohibited, so the offspring can be offered as a sacrifice. But Rabbi Eliezer says, no, it's forbidden. And so the idea is that this would be a parallel case. And according to Tanakh Kama, they would, just like they say that the offspring is permitted, so too they would say that the flour, that's a new thing that came from the stalk. The stalk was prohibited, but this is a new thing, and therefore it's permitted. And Rabbi Eliezer, who says that offspring is prohibited, would also say that the flour is prohibited. That's the hypothesis. But we reject this. Velav itemad Allah, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avu, Machloket keshenirbe'u basof iberu, Aval iberu basof nirbe'u, Dibra kol asurin, V'achaname ki iberu basof nirbe'u dameh. But Rav Nachman, in the name of Rabba bar Avu, said about this case that the Mishnah and Rabbi Eliezer, this controversy is only regarding a case where first the animal was involved in sin, before it became pregnant. And then afterwards, then it became pregnant, and now it gave birth and had this offspring. There, the machloket applies. Because in that case, there is at least a possibility, like Tanakh Kama says, that it's the mother that was involved in the sin. The offspring was never involved in the sin. It was conceived afterwards and born, and so in that case, the offspring is permitted. But in the case where first it became pregnant, while it was pregnant, this mother was involved in sin, then everybody would agree, even Tanakh Kama would agree that it's prohibited because the offspring is there. It exists. It's inside the mother, but it's part of the body of the animal that is involved in sin. And therefore everybody would agree that it's prohibited even after it's born. Now this case of the wheat stalk that's turned into flour is more similar to the pregnant animal, because just like with the pregnant animal, all the material is there, it goes from inside to outside. So too, With the wheat stalk, the material, the grain is there. It just turns into being a whole wheat stalk, and then it's smashed up into flour. But the material is all still there. And therefore, according to this, everybody would agree that in the case of the wheat stalk, the flour remains prohibited. So that would be the more appropriate analogy. There's another version of what we just said. What we just said here was in the name of Rav Nachman, who said it in the name of Rabbah bar Avu. But there's another version that says the same thing, but without that attribution, meaning that Mor Zutra himself said this. Over here, Mor Zutra said that the machloket applies to both, but in this other version, Mor Zutra said no, there's a distinction between the cases. Ika d'amre machloket kishenirbu ulbasof iberu aval iberu ulbasof nirbeu dibra kol hasur v'hanemile v'hanename ki iberu ulbasof nirbeu dameh. So same thing as we just said, just in a different name. That the machloket is only when it was a mother was involved in sin and then later became pregnant. There, the Tanna Kama could say that the conception was after its sin, so therefore this offspring was never involved in sin and is permitted. But if it was pregnant first, and while it was pregnant it was involved in sin, everybody would agree that's prohibited because the fetus is there at the time of the sin. And in this case of the wheat stalk, the flour is already there inside the grain. And therefore, everybody would agree that this case is prohibited. We ask, Kachi Ashta, is this comparison really accurate? Hata meikara behema v'hashta behema, dashahu da'achiza be'anpaha, hacha meikara chite v'hashta kimcha. In fact, these two cases are not comparable. In the case of the pregnant animal, the fetus, the baby, the offspring, is there beforehand. While it was pregnant, it is a behema, and now it's also a behema. Except beforehand, it was just inside the mother, and now it's outside the mother. But it existed already in the same form that it's going to be. It's just, a day before it's born and a day after it's born, it looks just about the same. So it doesn't actually change form. And that's why you would say that it's prohibited if an animal sinned while it was pregnant, and now it's born, so certainly it will remain prohibited. However, the animal that gives birth is compared to something that's behind a door. Interesting comparison for something giving birth. The idea is that it's already an offspring. It's already an animal. It's just that there's a door holding it in place inside the womb. Then when it gives birth, the door opens and then it can come out. This is an important source for how we understand what a fetus is. According to this, a fetus is just like a baby. It just happens to be behind the door and waiting to come out. So that's regarding the animal. Whereas in the case of the wheat, beforehand it was a wheat stalk. Now it's flour. That's a completely different thing. It could change its form. You even call it a different name. And so maybe even those who say that in the case of the wheat stalk, the offspring is prohibited, they might very well say that in the case of flour, this is a new thing, totally new thing that has come forth, and therefore maybe it would be permitted. Okay, next question. If someone bows down to a palm tree and treats it like an idol, what about using its lulav for a mitzvah? Here's a palm tree and here's someone harvesting the dekel to be used as a lulav. And so the question here again is, since this tree is connected to the ground, so the tree will be permitted for secular use. That's not a problem. But now it's being used for holy use. Now it's not being used on the mizbeach. If it was being used on the mizbeach, that would be prohibited. But this is a kind of in-between case. We're using it for a mitzvah. And so is that considered like gavoa, or is that considered like a secular use and would be permitted? We're going to limit the scope of Resh Lakish's question, because if you're talking about a tree that was planted in the first place as an Asherah tree, then nobody would have a question, because that tree would be prohibited even for secular use. It was planted for that purpose, and everybody agrees that would be prohibited across the board. Rather, the question must be about a tree that was planted at first for a regular tree, permitted tree, and later on, after it grew, then it was worshipped. And even within that case, we have to limit it further, the question. And Beresh Lakish would have no question if we followed the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda, because he says that in this case it's also prohibited, even though it was planted as a regular tree. The fact that it was worshipped as an idol afterwards makes it prohibited even for secular use. So certainly it would be prohibited to use for a mitzvah. There'd be no question. Rather, we're asking according to Rabbanan, who say that if a tree was planted for permitted use and only worshipped as an idol afterwards, it's permitted for secular use. And so, but what about to use for a mitzvah? Mimi is kelape gavoa ola. Does it become repulsive and prohibited for gavoa? And again, gavoa here does not mean it's being used on the mizbeach. That would be prohibited. But here it's being used for a mitzvah. So, does it become prohibited for a mitzvah or not? That's the question according to that interpretation. However, now we're going to see another version of the question. We're not answering that version. Ki ata Rav Dimi amar ba'ashera shebitela kami ba'yaleh. Yesh dichui esel misvot en dichui esel misvot. Rav Dimi says, we're talking about a tree that was an asherah, was worshipped as an asherah, but then it was nullified through the process of nullification that we'll learn more about, and now it's no longer an asherah tree. Can you use that lulav from that tree? The question will depend on yesh dichui. Is there permanent disqualification when it comes to mitzvot or not? There's one opinion that says, yes, once something becomes disqualified to use for a mitzvah, in this case, while it was an asherah tree, its branches are prohibited. And once you cannot use it, once it's disqualified to use as a mitzvah, it's permanently disqualified even after the tree is nullified. And therefore it remains prohibited. Or do we say, en dichui, that even though something is prohibited and disqualified now to use for a mitzvah, it's not permanent. And if you would undo the asherah status by nullifying it, then it becomes permitted. And so this question will depend on that question. Well, let's see another case of yesh dichui or en dichui. Tifshot lemiditanan. We can answer the question based on the Mishnah in Masechet Chulin about this question. Kisahu v'nitgala patur melechasot. Kisahu haruach v'chayab lechasot. You have to, if you do shechita on a bird or a chaya, one has to cover up the blood with dirt. Now, let's say a person covered it up with dirt. Kisahu, he did it properly, but then some wind came and undid it. Patur, he did the mitzvah. He covered the blood, and so as long as he did the action of covering the blood, even if it becomes uncovered, he did the mitzvah, and he doesn't have to go and do it again. But what if he slaughters the bird? The blood goes on the floor, and before he gets a chance to cover it himself, some wind comes, pushes some dirt, and covers the blood on its own. So kisahu haruach, then he has to cover it up. Even though right now it's covered up, he didn't do it himself. So he still has an obligation to cover it. Now, how are you going to cover it if it's already covered? If you're asking that, we will explain. This law that you have to cover it if the wind covered it, that's only if it became uncovered again. So this is the case. You slaughter the bird, the blood goes on the floor, and you're planning on covering it, but wind comes and covers it up. Well, at that point, you can't cover it up. So what can you do? But you still have an obligation, but you can't do it. However, if another wind comes and blows off the dirt and the blood is still there, then you are liable. You have to go and cover it up. So that's what Rabbi Yochanan says. Only if it became uncovered again, then you have to cover it. But if it did not become uncovered again, you don't have to go expose it and then cover it again, because right now it's covered. So there's no mitzvah to do. And we wondered about that. Why is that true? That if it becomes uncovered again, you have to do it. Why don't we say, since the mitzvah is pushed off, so now it's pushed off. Once when the blood is there, fresh, I have to cover it. If the wind comes and covers it up, I did not fulfill the mitzvah, but the action is done. So the mitzvah is pushed off. Why don't we say, once a mitzvah is pushed off, it's pushed off permanently? But apparently we don't say that. The Papa learns from this Mishnah And the B'Yochanan's comment on the Mishnah that we learn that the mitzvot are not permanently disqualified, even if temporarily it cannot be done. If a situation changes and now it can be done, the mitzvah reappears. And so that is true regarding the blood that was covered and uncovered, and therefore we can say that that would be true also for the question of Resh Lakish. Even though this palm tree was prohibited for some time while it was an Asherah, but if it becomes nullified, then it'll be permitted again. And so we can answer the Resh Lakish's question in this version, the second version, according to Rav Dimi, who came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel and reported this version of the question. And so, why would this be a question? Can't we learn it from here? And we explain, no, Rav Papa Gufei Ba'eleh. Resh Lakish was asking this very question, whether we would agree with Rav Papa or not. Resh Lakish lives way before Rav Papa, so he wasn't quoting Rav Papa, but conceptually, he was asking the same question. And this is his question, Mifshat Beshita Le Rav Papa. Some versions don't have Rav Papa, because it doesn't make sense that Resh Lakish would say, oh, it's obvious that I agree with Rav Papa. It's just say without those words. It was obvious. Do we say it's obvious to Resh Lakish that that there is no permanent disqualification regarding misvot, and we would apply that for leniency and stringency, and therefore we would apply that here across the board, that just like with the blood, one has to cover it up again, even though it was disqualified for a time while it was covered. Now it becomes disqualified. The mitzvah reappears, and so too for the lulav, you can use it for a lulav, even though the tree was disqualified. Now now becomes qualified again. So yes, you can use it. So would we apply this principle of endichui across the board, or perhaps we are uncertain about how to apply this case, this rule. Maybe we apply it only for stringency. Stringency would be the case of blood, where it was covered, now it's uncovered. We don't know. Should we perform the mitzvah or not? Well, let's be stringent. We have a doubt, so we'll be stringent to say, yes, you should do the mitzvah just in case you need to do it and cover the blood again. But maybe we apply this only and stringency, but maybe we don't apply it for a leniency when it comes to the palm tree, and we're not sure. Well, it was disqualified to use as a lulav while it was an asherah tree. Now the tree is nullified and no longer avodah zara. So should we apply this to leniency and say that the lulav is now permitted? No, maybe not. Maybe we would only apply this rule if it's a stringency, but not for a leniency, and the palm tree would not be able to be used as a lulav. So that was the question of Resh Lakish in this version. Teku, in any case, we leave this question standing. Rav Papa asked the next question. Hamishtachaveh libhema samra mahu l'techelet. If someone bows down to an animal, what about its wool? Can it be used for techelet? This is related to the previous questions. Bowing down to a live animal does not make it prohibited for secular use, but it will make it prohibited for holy use. So, what about that, using it for techelet? We have to clarify the question, techelet demai. It depends, what are you using that techelet for? Techelet the kohanim, hainu ba'yad rami bar hama. Are you using the techelet for the clothing of the kohanim? If so, that is something that's actually used in the Bet HaMikdash, and therefore this question would be the same as Rami bar Hama's question, who asked, if you have a stalk of wheat that's attached to the ground and someone bows down to, it still remains permitted for secular use, but it's prohibited for holy use, but it changed form because you ground it into flour. And that would be the same as this case where you have an animal and then you have the wool, and you take the wool and you dye it and you spin it and you turn it into chelet and you make it something that is used in the Bet HaMikdash for the clothing of the Kohen Gadol. It's the same thing. The animal itself is prohibited to use as a sacrifice, but this is something that already comes from it and changes form. Why does Rami bar Chama have to ask the question if it's the same case conceptually as Rami bar Chama's? And if Rav Papa is asking whether you can use that techelet to make sisit, for any person to fulfill the mitzvah of sisit. That's the same as Shakish's question, that if someone took an Asherah tree, and can he use the Asherah tree will be permitted, it's connected to the ground, permitted for secular use, but it would be prohibited for use in Bet HaMikdash. However, can you take a lulav and use it for a lulav, for a personal mitzvah? Do we say a personal mitzvah is like Avoda or not? Well, that would be the same as sisit is also a personal mitzvah. Would that be the same, prohibited like something in the Bet HaMikdash, or permitted like a secular use? But Rish Lakish already asked that question. So why is Rav Papa asking this question again? And the answer is inachiname de la mi ba'ele va'etekami ba'ele ha mishum teika mileach aran yata. And we say indeed that Papa would not have to ask this question itself, because it is the same as the previous questions. And you can say that it's talking about using techelet for Bigdei Kohen Gadol. And for sure that would be the same as the law that we saw before of using flour on the Mizbeach. And so there's no need to ask this question. But the reason that he asked this question was not for this question itself, but rather for the follow-up questions that we wanted to ask. Samra mahu l'tchelet. First of all, which he asked, can you use the wool for techelet? And based on that answer, a further question. Karneha mahu lechasosrot, shokeha mahu lechalidin, benemeha mahu leforot. Can one use the horns of the animal for trumpets? And can one use the thigh bones as flutes? They would take animal bones, long bones that are hollow, and you can shape it and make it into a beautiful flute. And the Leviim can use that in playing instruments, and the Leviim would play instruments during the Korbanot. And how about the intestines? Can you use that for strings? Until today, strings for instruments, violin strings, are made out of cat gut. So yes, they would use guts for strings. So that's the question. Can you use these parts of this animal that the animal was worshipped while it was alive? So the animal itself cannot be used for a sacrifice, but can you use the parts of the animal for musical instruments in the Bet HaMikdash? So it depends. What is the status of the musical instruments in the Bet HaMikdash? If the main musical offering in the Bet HaMikdash is with an instrument, so therefore it's an integral part. While you're making a Korban Olah, you have to play instruments. It's part of the process. Then certainly they would be prohibited, because just like you cannot use the animal for a Korban, so too you cannot use it for any essential part of the process of making the Korban. And this is an essential process, so it would be prohibited. So that would be no question. Kiti ba'elach alibad de'aman de'amar Ikar shira bepe basume kala be'almahu umaitinan odim afilu hachi asir teko. Rather, we're asking the question according to the other opinion that says the main worship, the main offering of song is with one's mouth. The Levim would sing. That's sufficient. If they only sang, that would be enough to accompany the Korban, and one fulfills all of the rituals. And therefore, when we do play instruments, it's only to sweeten the sound of the singing. It sounds nicer when there are some instruments behind it. And so we bring it, but it's not actually necessary. So therefore, maybe it's permitted, or even though it's the instrumentals are only an accompaniment for the voice, which is the main thing, nevertheless, it is accompanying it and it is part of it, and therefore it would be prohibited to use the parts of an animal that was sacrificed for that. And we leave that question standing. This machloket, by the way, is actually very important to answer a different question. Were musical instruments played on Shabbat in the Bet HaMikdash? It depends on this. If musical instruments are a necessary part of the ritual, and you have to bring Korban Olah and Korban Musaf on Shabbat, then you'd have to play instruments also, even though instruments would violate at least a D'Rabbanan. So, but they're necessary, so they would override Shabbat. However, if the musical instruments are not an integral part of it, and you can get away with voices, well, you can't do something even in the Bet HaMikdash if you don't need to, and you don't need to play instruments. According to that, it seems that they would not have played instruments on Shabbat. Ba'e Rabba. Another question by Rabba. Hamishtachave le'ma'ayan. Memav mahu lin sachim. If someone bows down to a spring of water, can one use that water on Sukkot for nisuch hamayim? Now you're bringing it onto the Mizbeach, but it was worshipped. Now, something that's a ma'ayan, a spring of water, is connected to the ground. So even if one bows down to it, it will not become prohibited for secular use. But perhaps it becomes prohibited for Bet HaMikdash use. Now, what's the detail of the question? Why would you think it's okay? Maybe the question that we're asking is, when the person bows down to the spring of water, what does he have in mind? Is he bowing down to his own reflection in the water? If so, the water would be permitted, because he's not bowing down to the water, he's only bowing down to his reflection. So he might be a crazy guy, a narcissist, but he's not making the water prohibited. So do we say that he has in mind the reflection, or does he have in mind that he's bowing to the water, and therefore the water would become prohibited? If that's the question that we're asking, then why use such a complicated case of the water that's in the spring, and whether it can be used for nisuch hamayim or not? Just ask a regular question about water in a bucket. And the question is, if he bows down to it, would it be prohibited for ordinary use? See, because in a bucket, it's not connected to the ground. So if someone would worship the water would become prohibited even for secular use. Or do you say he's only bowing down to his reflection in the water, and in such a case, it's permitted? So if the question is, we don't know if he means in his reflection or the water, then use a simple case. You don't have to do a more complicated case that the water is in the river, and because it's in the river, well, certainly permitted for secular use. The question is, can it be used on the Mizbeach? Why using such a complicated case? And therefore, it must be that is not our question. In fact, he's not bowing down to his reflection. That's not the problem. He's bowing down to the water. And here is our question: Lemaya de kameh kasagid vekama'eh azdu, or dema ledabrona demaya kasagid. When he bows down, is he bowing down to this water that's in front of him? And the water is moving, so he bows down to the water in front of him. After 2 seconds, that water already moved down the river, and each piece of the water keeps moving, and therefore the next time when you come a little bit later and draw water, that's different water than the one he bowed down to. The prohibited water he bowed down to is somewhere downstream, and therefore the new water that he gets from upstream is permitted. Do we say that? Or do we say he's bowing down to the entire flow of the river, and all of the current, all of the river is one body, and if he's bowing down to some part of it, all of it becomes prohibited? That's the question. This halachic question is related to a key philosophical question by the pre-Socratics. Heraclitus said famously that one cannot step into the same river twice. What he meant by that is, you enter into the river once, you're entering into a certain part of the water. But then when you come back, you cross the river and you come back, now that water already is gone, is already downstream, and now you're stepping into a different part of the water, a different river. And so you cannot step into the same river twice. The idea of there is that everything always changes. Other philosophers says, no, you consider the river all one thing. And so this would be a halachic application of that philosophical question. And now we ask about this. Umi mi taseri, would the water become forbidden, even in such a case, when he had in mind the water, even if you say the whole river is one thing, would it become prohibited? We have a principle that water that belongs to the public does not become forbidden. If you have a public stream, a public river, public reservoir, and one person bows down to it, you're going to make it prohibited for everyone? It doesn't belong to him. You can't make something prohibited that doesn't belong to you. So even if he had that in mind, it should be permitted. Some versions say me'ar'eh. Rather, it must be a case where he bows down to his own river, the river, part of the river that's on his own ground. So he does own that part of the spring, and therefore when he bows down to it, it will make that prohibited. So do we say that part of it now is moves on, and so the rest of the river is okay? Or do we say that we consider the whole current to be one and the same, and therefore it remains prohibited? That's the question. We don't give an answer, but at least we clarified what the question is about. Next Mishnah, Mishaya beto samuch la'avoda zara v'nafal, asur libnoto. If someone lives right next door to a pagan temple and they have a shared wall between them, the same wall on one side is his home, and the other side it's the pagan temple, and that wall falls down, the homeowner is prohibited from rebuilding it, because if he rebuilds that wall, then that will benefit the idolatry by being able to use that wall. We're talking about a case where originally, this was not a pagan temple when the wall was first there, and then became a pagan temple afterwards, so now he's not allowed to rebuild it. Kesad Yaseh, what's he going to do? He needs a fourth wall for his house. And the answer is Kones, Betoch Shelo, Arba Amot, Uboneh. So he'll have to withdraw into his own property 4 Amot and build the wall there, and leave some empty space between the edge of his wall and the border of the property, so that the Avodah Zara will have to build its own wall, and his wall will not benefit them. Shelo v'shel avodah zara nidon mechesa al mechesa. Now, what if there are 2 walls, and there's a little bit of space in between? So, shelo v'shel avodah zara, if there's a wall, his own wall, and that of avodah zara, so then we take the space that's in between and we cut it in half. And he can then rebuild a new wall and use half of that space in between is his property. And then let's say there's 2 amot of space in between. That's his own property. So he goes from there another 2 amot. So we'll have 4 amot altogether. And so he'll still be 4 amot from the border in that case. Avanav aisav afaro metamin kesheres shenemar shakes teshakesenu. The bricks of the wall, or its wood, or dust from that wall, if that the part of the wall that belonged to Avodah Zara makes something else tameh, the same as a creepy crawly. As it says regarding Avodah Zara, shakesh teshakesenu, you shall detest it. And that's the same word as sheketz. So this is a law, although number 1 is prohibited from use, but in addition to being prohibited, it also will cause tum'ah. And then people will make sure to really stay away from it, since it has a high level tameh status like that of a sheretz. Rabbi Akiva omer kinida shenemar tizrem kimo davase tomar lo manida metamea b'masaf avodah zara metamea b'masar. Rabbi Akiva agrees that those bricks and stones and wood is tameh, but not in the status of a sheretz, but rather like a woman who is a nida. As a pasuk in Yeshaya says regarding idolatry, you will put them far away, like a nida. You shall say to it, go away. And the difference is that just like a nida, one becomes tameh by carrying her even without touching her. So too, something of avodah zara, one becomes tameh by carrying it. Let's say you're carrying it in a basket or on top of something, then one becomes tameh, which is not true of a sheretz. Gemara, v'ha'ka marvach la'avodah zara. If the shared wall falls, and then you're going to move your wall 4 amot in, well then, aren't you benefiting the avodah zara by giving the avodah zara 4 amot of empty space? Because you're not using it, your wall's over here. Now that empty space, the avodah zara will come and use, and now you're still benefiting the idolatry. Amar Rav Chanina Mesura da'avad le bet hakiseh. Rav Chanina Mesura says, no, you designate that area as a bathroom, like an outhouse, and so it's still yours, and you're using it for something that's disgusting anyway, and it doesn't need a wall, and so you just have that area designated to be an outhouse, and so that will not benefit avodah zara, and you can use it for something. Hold on, but don't you need modesty? If it's a bathroom and you're going to be uncovering yourself, then you need a wall, but you can't build a wall because the wall has to be with 4 amot inside. So you're out in the open. How can you use that as a bathroom? And the answer is you make it a nighttime bathroom. When it's dark out, so you don't need a wall, and so you can use it at night. והאמר מור, איזהו שנוע הנפנה בלילה במקום שנפנה ביום. ואף אגב דאוקימנה בכדרך, מיהו צניעותה באה למעבד. Wait a second, but that's not sufficient to use it at night, because the master said in a braita, who is called a modest person? Someone who relieves himself at night in the same place that he relieves himself during the day, which in a simple reading means that just like during the day you go to an enclosed area, private, so too at night. Even though it's dark out, you don't go in the middle of in the open area, but rather also you go to a private area. Now this baraita we already did explain. That's not talking about necessarily the place that you go to, but rather the manner in which one goes. That just like during the day, one would uncover his clothing only a little bit, whatever is necessary in order to relieve himself, but not more. So too at night, even though it's dark and nobody's around and nobody can see, still you should only take off a little bit of clothing, the minimum amount possible. So even though we said it's actually talking about the manner in which one clothes oneself and relieves oneself and not necessarily the place, still, you still have to be modest, and to go and out in the open without any walls is still going to be improper, even at night. So how could you say it's talking about a nighttime bathroom? And the answer is, you designate that area as a bathroom for children. Little kids, they don't really know what modesty is. They walk around, and so little children, they will go to the bathroom there. Or maybe one makes a fence out of thorns and shrubs. Just a little flimsy fence, not something that can hold up a roof or anything, but a small fence, that a thin fence that the Avoda Zara will not be able to use. They're not going to use it to put their beams on, but it's sufficient to keep out anybody looking, and so you can make it a regular bathroom even during the daytime, even for adults in that area. So that way, by designating it as an outhouse, that way the Avoda Zara will not use it, and you're not benefiting the Avoda Zara. Next Mishnah, Shelosha batim hen. בית שבנאו בתחילה לעבודה זרה, הרי זה אסור. סיידו וחיידו לעבודה זרה וחידש נוטל מח שחידש. הכניס לתוכה עבודה זרה והוציאה, הרי זה מותר. There are three types of houses with regard to the laws of idolatry. If a house was built in the first place to be a pagan temple to use as worship, then the whole house is prohibited. The only way to make it unprohibited would be if a non-Jew built it as for idol worship, then the non-Jew would have to nullify it in some way, and then it could be permitted. But otherwise, the whole building, the whole structure itself is an idol. If someone took a regular house that was a permitted house and then plastered or cemented it, he added a layer on top of the walls for Avodah Zarah, he maybe painted it, whatever he did, and so he made something new on it. Only that which he added new is prohibited, and so therefore he can just take off that layer of plaster or cement, and the rest of the house is permitted because it was built in a permitted way, so only that which is added is prohibited. If you have a home that was built for permitted purposes and one just brought in an idol temporarily and then took it back out, the house remains permitted because it was only used temporarily. He had to house an idol. Amar Rav, now Rav says if someone goes to a house, it's a permitted house, a regular house, and bows down to it, he makes that house prohibited. Now this seems like a new category that we haven't seen before. So how do we fit this in? Alma kasavar talush basov chibero ketalush dameh va'anan benaotenan. It seems that according to Rav, if you have something that is detached, let's say bricks or rocks or something that you quarried, and then you reattached them and put them together and built a house, meaning you built a house in a permitted way, nevertheless it remains like something that is not connected to the ground. And that's why when someone takes this and bows down to it, it becomes prohibited. Just like anything that's not connected to the ground, a statue or whatever, someone bows down to it, it becomes prohibited. So to the house, even though it's built in a permitted way, now becomes prohibited. But this seems to contradict the first case of the Mishnah that says a house is only prohibited if you built it in the first place as an idolatrous house. So that sounds like if you built it as a permitted house, it remains permitted even if you bow down to it afterwards. So how can we reconcile Rav with the Mishnah? And the answer is bena'o af al pi shelo hishtachava lo. Hishtachava af al pi shelo bena'o. In fact, both cases are prohibited. If you built it as an idol worship house, even if you did not bow down to it, it's prohibited. And if you bow down to it, even though you built it in the first place as a regular house, it also becomes prohibited. So Rav is adding another law, not contradictory. We ask, but then why does the Mishnah says there are 3 types? It should say there are 4 types of houses. And the answer is kevan delinyan bitul bana v'ishtachava chad kachashib le. No, because for the law of nullification, it doesn't really matter whether it was built in the first place as avodah zara or it was built regular and then bowed down to. In both cases, the non-Jew would have to nullify it. So since it has the same law of nullification, therefore the Mishnah only makes one category for both of those cases. There's no point. The point of the Mishnah was to show how do you undo it. There is a case where the whole house is prohibited, and then you'd have to nullify the house. That would include both the case that it says and Rav's case, and then another category is when you just have to remove the plaster. Another category is when you don't have to do anything. That was the main point of the Mishnah, but in fact, both cases are prohibited when you build it in the first place as an idolatrous house, and also when you built it as a regular house and someone bows down to it afterwards. Next Mishnah, Shalosh Abanin Hem, Eben Shechasaba Metechela Lebimos, Harezo Asura. Siyada v'chiyeda l'shem avodah zara, notel ma shesiyed v'chiyed muteret. Hamid aleha avodah zara v'sileka, harezo muteret. There are 3 types of stones, parallel to the 3 types of houses that we just saw. If you have a stone that was hewn to begin with in order to use as a platform for avodah zara, then the entire stone is prohibited. Here's an example of a platform, and there would be some kind of idol on top of it. So then the entire thing is prohibited to begin with. And you'd have to nullify it by an idolater coming and ruining it and nullifying its status. However, if originally the stone that was used was used for a permitted purpose, and afterwards, after the stone was made, someone came and plastered it or cemented it for the purpose of avodah zara, in that case, the way to nullify it would be simply to remove the plaster that was added, and then the stone is permitted. If someone took a permitted pedestal and put an avodah zara on top of it temporarily and then took it off, then the pedestal remains permitted. You don't have to do anything, just take it off. Amar Rabbi Ameh, v'hu shesiyed v'chiyed begufa shel even. Rabbi Ameh says, when does it become prohibited, something that originally was permitted, and now you added a layer? That's only if you plastered or cemented within the stone itself, meaning that when it came and carved or engraved into the stone itself, then the stone becomes prohibited, and you'd have to shave it down totally. But if someone just added a layer on top of it as an ornament externally, then the stone itself does not even become prohibited. We ask, wait a second, shouldn't this Mishnah be parallel to the previous Mishnah regarding a house? And in a case of a house, we're not adding a layer of cement or engraving within the wall of the house itself, but rather it's only external. And even though it's only external, still the house becomes prohibited. So here also, it should be, even if it's an external layer, it should make it prohibited, not only if it's engraved. And the answer is, no, when you plaster a house, there is space between the bricks or between the planks, and when you plaster it, the plaster is going in between those spaces. So that is in fact going into the wall itself, like something being engraved, and therefore it becomes prohibited. And that's the same as the pillar or the stone that one is an etching or engraving into it. Milas kinan de shia v'hadar shia. Wait a second. In the case of a house, isn't the normal case that we're talking about where someone built the house and plastered it in a permitted way, thinking it's just a regular house? You always put some plaster onto the walls, and then someone came and put another layer of plaster on top of it for Avoda Zara. And so the second layer is not filling in any gaps because the first layer that's put within a permitted way is already filling in those gaps. And so therefore, it seems like it's not parallel to the case of a stone. Rather, this law of the bi'ameh, that something is only true when it's engraved inside, he wasn't talking about how it becomes prohibited, but rather he's talking about how it becomes permitted. How do you nullify its status as avodah zarah? And he's teaching. He's teaching you, even though the second person, the idolater, came and he plastered or cemented within the stone itself and he engraved into the stone, you might think that it becomes prohibited totally. There's no way to undo it because he went within the stone. No, therefore he comes to teach that as long as he takes off that which he added on, he's got to rub it down, erase it, then the rest of the stone is permitted. You might have thought that since he plastered or cemented within the stone itself, it would be the same status as if the stone was hewed for an idolatrous purpose, and therefore it becomes totally prohibited, and you'd have to go through a more complicated process of nullifying it. Titasad kula becomes totally prohibited. Kamash malan. Therefore, it comes to teach not so. Even if one is engraving within the stone itself, it's permitted as long as you remove whatever you added. Then the stone itself becomes permitted. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.